Shir is dedicated to Nishmas Rachalei Bas Rav Chaim Tzvi. I wanted to start a brand new malacha that we haven't covered at all, and that is the malacha of Tofer, the malacha of sewing. And again, it's not a long malacha, but again, there are a lot of important principles with some common halacha l'maisa applications. So the Mishnah tells us in Masechah Shabbos Davayin Gilman Aleph that there's a malacha. One of the malachas is HaTofer Shtei Tfiros, that you're not allowed to go ahead and sew 2 stitches. The Mishnah defined it as 2 stitches. Where did you find this in the Mishkan? So Rashi explains, where did you find this in the Mishkan? The Tofer v'kareas b'yiriosu. They existed in the Yirios. They used to have the curtains of the Mishkan that were draped over the Mishkan, and machlokas actually between the Yushami and the Bavli, how many curtains were there? Was it all one long curtain, which really did not require any tefira, or there was a series of curtains that had to be sewn together? The Bavli assumed there was a series of curtains that had to be sewn together. The Yirios, this is what Rashi is referring to, and you sewed the Yirios together. Yushami says no, it was all one Yiriya, but rather what would happen once in a while, and this is a prelude also to Melechas Korea, is sometimes you had bugs, moths, and the like that would eat holes into the urea. So they had to go ahead and fix the single urea. So what would they do? It had a hole in it. So this hole you can't really sew up. So they tear it, korea, and by tearing it, they'd make a nicer line or seam to work with, and then they would go ahead and sew that up. So that was a kriya, that was almanas lit for, and it was a tefira, and the Mishnah tells us, shtei tfiros, that is the prohibition. Tosas points out already, famous Tosas, Divmas ha'oset, and daf ein gimel amud aleph, that it is somewhat unusual that when it comes to all of the malachos, when it comes to borer and tochen and ofer and zoreya and kotzer and so forth, there is no shear mentioned. There is no amount that's mentioned, even though every single malach has its own shear, but you don't find that mentioned in the Mishnah. Over here by Tofer and by a few of the other malachos, you have a shear mentioned. That's what Tosas comments. Tzarech lafaresh. You need an explanation. Lama piresh kan uve oreg uve potseya uve tofer uve kosev shear tfei mi b'shar. Why, when it comes to certain malachos, ha'oseh shnei batenirim, tofer shtei tfiros, kosev shtei osios, why do you have the shear mentioned in the Mishnah? That would seem to be extraneous. The Mishnah is telling us the avos malachos. So tell me how tofer, just like tell me how borer. Why does it say the shear? Tosfos does not explain the reason. He says tzarech lefarish. Now the tzarech lefarish of Tos could be understood in one of 2 ways. Either tzarech lefarish, you need to explain when you give shear. Please explain to the students. It's so obvious and easy. I don't need to lay it out for you on a silver platter, but please explain it to those who are studying this Mishnah. Or it was a tough thing to explain, and therefore perhaps like a tzarachin. So the pashtus is the first approach, and this is what the achronim indicate, that tzarech lefarish, there's a very rational explanation why certain malachos you have the shear, others you do not. What's the reason that by Tofer, for example, the shear is mentioned? You see, when it comes to most of the malachos, the malacha is, as written in the Mishnah, choresh is to plow, zoreya is to plant, borer is to select, ofer is to cook, to bake. That's the malacha. That's the geder ha-malacha. The shear, how much you have to select, kigrogeres, the shear, that's extraneous to the malacha. That's not part of the definition of the malacha. Yes, you have to satisfy the shear in order to be chayev a korban chatas, chayev skila, for sure. But the shear is a t'nai in the malacha. A t'nai lehitchayev. It's not part of the malacha itself. It's a t'nai. When it comes to certain malachos, however, the shear is part of the definition of the malacha. When it comes to, for example, kosev, the number 2, kosev shtei osios, it's not a din in shear, but the definition of meleches kosev is really not writing, and how much do you have to write to be chayav 2 letters, but the definition of kosev is writing 2 letters. Why is that your definition? Because what's the source of kosev in the Mishkan? The source of kosev in the Mishkan is the krushim. They used to label the krushim and the sockets. The malach is labeling. Labeling requires 2. And therefore you only be chayiv if you go ahead and write 2 letters. The 2 letters is not a din in shear. It's a din in the geder ha-malacha. Ha'oseh shnei batei nirim. That's the definition of the malacha. When it comes to Tofer, the same exact thing. The Tofer shtei tfiros is not a din shiurim, that in order, Tofer needs a tfira chashuva. And how much is the tfira chashuva? If you go ahead and use 2 stitches, that's called a tfira chashuva. Anything less than that is not considered to be tfira chashuva. That's not the pshat. The pshat lechora is, what does sewing mean? When you go ahead and sew, you take 2 garments, 2 fabrics, and you bind them together into a single unit. That's what Tofer is. Take 2 separate fabrics, and by sewing them together with the medium of the stitch, you go ahead and make a single unit of them. Now, if you go ahead and just write 1 through 1 stitch, what's a stitch? You stick the needle in one way. It starts on one side, ends up on the other side. So what have you really done? Would that really establish a